They called it a diplomatic warning. They wrapped it in the language of international order, democratic standards, and global peace. But I heard the message loud and clear. It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. 3 nights ago, at exactly 9:13 p.m., a sealed dispatch from the United Nations landed on my desk, stamped in blue, signed by multiple envoys. Backed by nations that haven't stepped foot in Africa without demanding something in return, it said, failure to comply with international expectations will result in coordinated sanctions. They didn't name me directly, but they didn't have to. Because every line, every paragraph, every passive-aggressive phrase was aimed at one person, me. Burkina Faso's refusal to bow was now a global problem. And do you know why? Because I've done the one thing they fear most. I stopped asking for permission. They told me I had to reinstate Western-aligned economic partnerships. They said freezing Israeli deals would destabilize the region. They said our military alliance with Mali and Niger was provocative. They even questioned our decision to remove French from official education. But here's the truth they don't want broadcasted. Every decision I made came from one principle. Africa is done playing host to its own exploitation, and now the UN wants me to apologize. Apologize for what? For protecting my people from foreign surveillance disguised as development? For ending contracts that siphoned gold, cotton, and uranium out of our soil and left us nothing but debt and dependency? For refusing to host proxy wars on African land while our children starve and our farmers bleed? I will not apologize. Not to the UN, not to NATO, not to Israel, not to France, and certainly not to men who've built their empires on the backs of our silence. But let me tell you what they really fear. It's not just about sanctions. It's not just about policy. It's about precedent. Because if Burkina Faso resists, then what stops Mali from resisting? Then Niger, Guinea, Congo. Then the entire continent begins to ask a simple question. What if we just say no? That's the real threat. That's why they want to make an example out of me. So here's what I did. At sunrise, I walked into the presidential media room. No press, no script, no Western journalists. Just one camera. And one sentence. Let the United Nations try. That clip? It exploded. Within hours, it was playing in refugee camps in Sudan, in schoolrooms in Uganda, on phone screens in Lagos, Soweto, and Harlem. Because this isn't about me, it's about all of us. And yet, behind closed doors, something even bigger was brewing. At a private security summit in Geneva, attended by 14 Western nations, I was told that Burkina Faso's policies were endangering international investment confidence. In plain English, if you don't reverse course, we'll make sure no African nation dares follow your lead. And how do they do that? Sanctions, isolation, economic warfare, the same tactics they used on Cuba, on Venezuela, on Iran. But here's the thing they forgot. We are not alone anymore. We've built something they underestimated, a network of African states not held together by foreign money, but by shared purpose. A defense pact that doesn't answer to NATO. A vision that doesn't come from Washington or Brussels, but from Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou. So let me be clear. Burkina Faso will not comply. We will not allow the UN to weaponize global opinion while turning a blind eye to genocide in Gaza and coups funded by foreign intelligence. And if sanctions come, then we will sanction them with our truth. We will expose every backroom deal, every stolen resource, every rigged election they pretended not to see. Because here's what they forget. Africa has a memory now, and we are remembering everything. When I left that meeting, my advisors were worried. Not because they feared the UN, but because they feared history repeating itself. You see, they know what happened in Libya. They know how a single UN resolution became the green light for bombs to fall over Tripoli. They remember how the West applauded liberation while Gaddafi's corpse was paraded in the street. They remember how his gold-backed currency plan disappeared along with billions in oil. So, when the UN knocks at our door and speaks of human rights and regional stability, I ask, stability for whom? Because every time Africa starts to stand up, they call it a threat. And every time we bend our knees, they call it cooperation. The very next morning, I was invited to join a conflict de-escalation summit. They wanted me to sit at the table, but not to speak, to listen, to be reminded of my place. They had already prepared the script. Traore must tone down his rhetoric. Traore must restore confidence in Western diplomacy. Traore must disavow his alliances with so-called rogue states. I didn't attend. Instead, I walked into our parliament chamber. I looked every single member in the eye, our elders, our veterans, our farmers turned legislators, and I said, they want to break us with words. But if we fold now, our children will pay the interest on this silence for generations. And I told them what the West fears more than war: unity. Because sanctions only work when we stand alone, because isolation only works if we isolate ourselves, but we won't. I reached out that same day to our allies in Mali and Niger. We opened our shared emergency reserves. We rewired logistical networks to bypass European financial systems, and we activated our broadcast alliances. Within 12 hours, every major Pan-African radio station was airing a single message: the African dawn does not need permission, not a slogan, a declaration. But while the media was focused on my defiance, the UN was quietly moving chess pieces. They pressured 2 African leaders to condemn my statements publicly. They offered development packages in exchange for diplomatic distance from Burkina Faso. One of them refused. The other folded. That's when I realized. But they miscalculated something important. They thought their threats would make me cautious. Instead, they made me louder. So I held a press conference. No Western journalists, no rehearsed Q&A. I simply said, if standing for dignity brings punishment, then let every sanction fall like rain, because even under the storm we will plant seeds of sovereignty. That phrase, it caught fire. It trended across African Twitter. It was graffitied on school walls in South Africa. It was quoted in hip-hop lyrics in Dakar and Atlanta. They wanted silence. They got an anthem. Let me tell you what they're really afraid of. Not my army, not my speeches, not my policies. They're afraid of the idea that a young African leader can rise without their approval, that I can speak without a teleprompter written in Paris, that I can lead without asking Washington for permission. They're afraid that if Burkina Faso survives this, others will try. And if others try. So they doubled down. An anonymous leak appeared in international media. Sources close to the UN suggest Burkina Faso's leadership is endangering regional food supply. The same lie they told before they invaded Somalia. But we responded. With facts. With maps. With a full breakdown of our food security initiatives. All publicly available. And that's when I said, you cannot starve a people who already learned how to grow their own food without your loans. But the pressure kept building. France suspended a cultural exchange program. The EU paused infrastructure talks. The US downgraded our investment rating. And still I would not apologize. Because the world doesn't need more apologies from Africa. It needs more boundaries. The truth is, they never asked me to explain my actions. They demanded I undo them. Undo the Israeli expulsion. Undo the security alliances with Mali and Niger. Undo the broadcast ban on Western propaganda networks. Undo the very foundation of what we've been building. And what was their incentive? A seat at their table. But why would I dine with those who once looted our granaries? Why would I kneel before men who never stood for ours? Let me ask you, if a man poisons your well for 50 years and then offers you bottled water, do you trust him? Or do you dig deeper with your own hands until clean water flows again? We chose to dig, so I delivered my official response not on camera, not on Twitter, but directly through a sealed communiqué addressed to the UN Security Council. It contained just 7 words: you do not own the African future. That's it. No plea, no apology, no bending. And I had it translated into every official UN language, because I wanted no excuses, no misinterpretations, no diplomatic fog. Let them read it in Russian, in Arabic, in Mandarin, in English, in French, especially French. They didn't respond immediately, but I knew they were rattled. How? Because within 48 hours, 2 major Western outlets ran coordinated hit pieces. One labeled me a threat to regional harmony. Another called me the new Gaddafi armed with social media. They think that comparison scares me, but let me remind them Gaddafi gave Africans satellites when the West sold us static. Gaddafi tried to create a gold-backed dinar for all of Africa. If that's the legacy they fear repeating, then maybe they're the ones who should be afraid. But the attacks didn't stop at words. An anonymous diplomat leaked false intel suggesting our forces were preparing to destabilize ECOWAS borders. I knew what that was. A trap. A way to justify sanctions, embargoes, or worse. So I did what they didn't expect. I invited independent observers into our country, not Western agents, but journalists from Brazil, India, Algeria, nations with no colonial clause in our history. They came, they looked, they filmed, and what did they find? New roads, not tanks. Rebuilt schools, not barracks. Markets full of local produce, not black market weapons. Their footage made it to the global stage, and for once Africa told its own story. That's when the UN finally responded, not with diplomacy, but with a warning. Burkina Faso must immediately return to international norms of cooperation or face escalated measures. Escalated measures, the same language they used before Iraq, the same tone they used before Yugoslavia disintegrated, the same cold threat behind every peace mission that ends in blood. But I don't flinch at those words anymore. Because I've learned something. When a man stands alone, he can be destroyed. But when a continent rises together, no threat can break us. So I issued my counter-message, public, loud, unmistakable. I stood before the nation not in military uniform, but in traditional mossy cloth, and I said, let them sanction our soil. We'll plant with our hands. Let them block our air. We'll speak louder from the ground. Let them freeze our accounts. Our spirit was never for sale. We'll speak louder from the ground. That speech, it didn't just go viral, it went global. Not because of me, because of you. You, the youth who translated it into 10 dialects on TikTok. You, the elders who played it from radios in village centers. You, the diaspora who made it trend from Atlanta to Accra. You carried it. And now they know. They know that this generation of Africans doesn't just chant in the streets. We educate. We build. We remember. And most dangerous of all, we dream. But don't think this is over. They will come again. They'll offer new deals. They'll send new envoys. They'll try to buy loyalty with poisoned gifts. But I promise you, no matter what they threaten next, I will not kneel. Not for the UN. Not for Netanyahu. Not for any flag that flew over our stolen soil. I want you to understand something. This isn't about Burkina Faso anymore. It never was. This is about a blueprint they're desperate to burn, because if one African nation can break their script, others might follow. And that terrifies them. You've already seen the signs. In Mali, women now trade in local currencies, not the euro. In Niger, farmers refuse foreign seeds in favor of heirloom crops. In Guinea, they shut down IMF audits and launched a nationwide audit of their own. They call it rebellion. We call it reclamation. And guess what? We're not asking for permission anymore. But let me bring you into the room, the moment when everything shifted. 1 week after my televised statement, a private UN meeting took place. It wasn't publicized, but we had eyes in the room. And what was said behind closed doors was more dangerous than any open threat. A senior Western diplomat slammed his fist on the table and said, if Traore wins this round, the whole Sahel will think it can defy us. That's not diplomacy. That's colonial panic. They're not worried about weapons, they're worried about example, because power is never lost in a single act. It slips when people start believing in alternatives. And that is exactly what we're offering. But here's where the story gets darker. 3 days after that meeting, something happened that they didn't expect. A whistleblower inside their own ranks leaked the full transcript. Not to CNN or BBC, to Al Jazeera, to African independent media, to outlets they can't control. And the world saw their true face. The mask slipped, the diplomatic language cracked, and underneath, raw colonial panic. One line especially cut deep. We cannot allow African leaders to believe they can govern without Western oversight. Western oversight, as if we're still their protectorates, as if independence was just paperwork they could revoke, as if our sovereignty was a privilege they granted, not a right we claimed. That leak changed everything. Because suddenly, their threats weren't coming from a position of moral authority. They were coming from a position of exposed desperation. And that's when I knew we had already won the narrative war. But they weren't done fighting. The very next day, a coordinated cyber attack hit our government servers. Not the dramatic Hollywood kind. The quiet, surgical kind. Banking systems malfunctioned. Communications experienced technical difficulties. Power grids needed emergency maintenance. All on the same day. All exactly 72 hours after my refusal to attend their summit. Coincidence? The international media said yes. We knew better. So I did something they never expected. Instead of scrambling to fix the systems, I held another press conference, right in the middle of the blackout. By candlelight, from the steps of our parliament. They can turn off our lights, I said, but they cannot dim our vision. That image, me speaking by candlelight while the Capitol flickered in darkness, became iconic, not because it was planned, but because it was real. Raw, unbreakable. Within hours, supporters were holding vigils outside embassies worldwide, candles in London, candles in New York, candles in Paris, right outside the Élysée Palace. They tried to create a symbol of our weakness. Instead, they gave us a symbol of our resilience. But the real breakthrough came when the lights came back on. Because we didn't just restore our systems, we upgraded them. With technology from China, from Russia, from India. With partners who didn't demand we remove French from our schools in exchange for fiber optic cables. That's when they realized every pressure they applied was teaching us to become more independent. Every threat was making us more resourceful. Every isolation was forcing us to find new allies. They were creating exactly what they feared, a Burkina Faso that didn't need them at all. So they escalated again. This time, through what they call economic instruments. A coordinated campaign to downgrade our credit rating. A sudden discovery of money laundering concerns in our banking sector. A mysterious audit of our gold reserves. Standard playbook. The same one they used to break Venezuela's economy. But here's what they didn't count on. We had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. Not preparing to surrender, preparing to survive. Secret agreements with the Central Bank of Russia for currency swaps. Bilateral trade deals with India that bypass Western financial systems entirely. A continental African payment system that settles in local currencies. Every threat they made had taught us to build alternatives, and now those alternatives were ready. When the Western banks froze our accounts, we activated Eastern partnerships. When credit agencies downgraded our rating, we launched peer-to-peer lending with African diaspora communities. When they questioned our gold reserves, we proved ownership through blockchain verification that couldn't be hacked or manipulated. For every weapon in their arsenal, we had built a shield. But the moment that broke their strategy completely, it came from an unexpected source. A two-year-old university student in Ouagadougou named Aminata posted a TikTok video. She wasn't a politician, wasn't an activist, wasn't even particularly political. She was just tired. Tired of watching her president get lectured by people who had never walked her streets. Tired of seeing her country apologize for standing up. Tired of the world treating Africa like a child that needed constant supervision. So she made a video. 60 seconds, no script, just truth. My president said no to people who have been robbing us for 60 years, and now they're calling him a dictator? The same people who sold us weapons and bought our resources while our people went hungry? They're lecturing us about democracy, about human rights, while they fund genocide in Gaza and coups in our neighbors? No, we're done being lectured. We're done being patient. We're done asking for scraps from tables built with our gold. That video exploded, not just in Africa, everywhere. Young people in Brazil shared it, students in India translated it, activists in Palestine reposted it with their own stories. Because the anger wasn't just African, it was universal. The anger of every people tired of being told how to live by those who exploit them. And that's when they knew they had lost. Because you can sanction a government, you can isolate a leader, but you cannot sanction an idea. And the idea that small nations could say no to superpowers. That idea was spreading faster than they could contain it. So they tried one last card, the oldest one in their deck. They offered me a deal. Not publicly, not through official channels. Through a midnight envoy who slipped into our capital like a shadow. The offer was simple. Reverse course on 3 key policies. The Israeli expulsion, the military alliance with Mali and Niger, and the ban on Western broadcast networks. In exchange, complete economic rehabilitation, removal from all watch lists, full restoration of diplomatic relations, and a personal guarantee that no sanctions would ever target Burkina Faso again. The envoy said, I had 48 hours to decide, that this was their final gesture of goodwill, that rejecting this offer would mean entering uncharted waters. I listened. I nodded. I thanked him for making the long journey. Then I said, tell your masters that uncharted waters don't scare sailors who learn to navigate by the stars. He left that night. By morning, the offer had leaked to international media, not from our side, from theirs. Because they wanted the world to see what I had rejected. They wanted to paint me as unreasonable, stubborn, a leader who chose conflict over compromise. But the leak backfired. Because the world saw something else. They saw a leader who couldn't be bought, who wouldn't trade his people's dignity for economic comfort, who meant what he said when he said no. And in a world full of politicians who say one thing in public and negotiate the opposite in private, that authenticity cut through every cynic's armor. But let me tell you what happened in those 48 hours. What they didn't see. What the cameras never captured. The phone calls that came flooding in. First, from my own cabinet. My Minister of Finance, sweating as he showed me projected GDP losses. My Defense Minister, warning about military isolation. My economic advisor, painting worst-case scenarios on a whiteboard until it looked like a horror movie. Mr. President, he said, hands shaking, if we reject this deal, we're gambling with the future of 22 million people. I looked at that whiteboard, at the charts showing potential economic collapse, at the graphs predicting mass unemployment, at the projections that made our future look like a graveyard of broken dreams. And then I asked one question, what does that chart look like if we accept? Silence. Because they knew, we all knew. Accepting meant returning to the cage. A comfortable cage, maybe. A cage with economic incentives and international recognition. But still a cage. And cages don't create GDP growth. They create dependency. They create the illusion of prosperity while the real wealth flows elsewhere. They create gratitude for scraps from tables built with your own gold. The second call came from an African head of state. One I respect. One who had walked this path before and chosen differently. Ibrahim, he said, I accepted a similar deal 15 years ago. My economy stabilized. My people ate better. International media praised my pragmatism. And? I asked. And today, I sit in meetings where Europeans tell me which Chinese companies I'm allowed to trade with. I sign documents approving military bases that protect their oil pipelines, not my people. I smile for photographs while they design my education curriculum. His voice cracked. I fed my people's bodies, Ibrahim, but I starved their spirits. Don't make my mistake. The third call was different. It came from a blocked number at 3 a.m., an American voice, calm, professional, not threatening, almost fatherly. President Traore, you're a young man with a long future ahead of you. This doesn't have to be your Gaddafi moment. Accept the offer. Live to fight another day. History will remember you as the leader who chose wisdom over pride. I almost laughed. History will remember me, I said, as the leader who chose Africa over approval. The line went dead. But the most important call came last. From my grandmother, 93 years old, born under French colonial rule, lived through independence, watched 6 decades of African leaders promise change and deliver excuses. Yamba, she said my childhood name, they're offering you what they offered your grandfather. What do you mean, grandmother? A chance to be the good African, the reasonable one, the one who understands his place in their world. She paused. Your grandfather took that deal. And for 40 years, he watched French companies extract our uranium while our children couldn't afford to go to school. He died regretting that choice every single day. Her voice strengthened. Don't die with that regret, Yamba. Some bridges are meant to be burned. That conversation ended my debate. When those 48 hours expired, I didn't just reject their offer. I called a live broadcast. No warning to international media. No prepared statements for foreign embassies. I sat before our people and said, they offered us a golden cage. We choose the difficult freedom. And then I did something they never expected. I revealed the exact terms of their secret offer. Every condition, every incentive, every threat wrapped in diplomatic language. I read it word for word. On live television. In Moray, French, English, and Arabic. Because secrecy is the oxygen of oppression, and I wanted the world to see exactly what international partnership looks like when the cameras stop rolling. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, similar offers being made to other African leaders began leaking. Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, Ghana, all receiving variants of the same deal, all being told they were special cases, all being asked to compromise their sovereignty for economic comfort. The pattern became undeniable. This wasn't diplomacy, it was a continental auction, and they were bidding for our dignity with our own stolen wealth. But something beautiful happened. Instead of dividing us, their tactics united us. Because now we could see the full chessboard. We could see how they played one African nation against another, how they used economic promises to prevent continental cooperation, how they kept us grateful for crumbs by making sure we never shared a full meal. That's when the WhatsApp group started. Informal at first, just a few African leaders sharing information, comparing notes on the pressures they were facing, the offers they were receiving, the threats wrapped in diplomatic language. But it grew, expanded, evolved, until it became something unprecedented. A continental early warning system, a way to coordinate responses to Western pressure, a digital solidarity that couldn't be monitored or controlled. When France threatened Mali with sanctions, we all knew immediately. When the EU paused aid to Niger, the notification reached all of us in real time. When international media launched coordinated attacks on Guinea's leadership, we shared counter-narratives within minutes. They had taught us to communicate like a resistance movement, and we had learned the lesson well. But the real breakthrough came when China made an offer. Not to me individually, but to our entire alliance. To Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Burkina Faso collectively. A comprehensive development package, infrastructure without colonial strings, trade partnerships without political interference, military cooperation without permanent bases. The terms were simple: respect for sovereignty, mutual benefit, long-term partnership without ownership. It wasn't perfect, no international relationship ever island, but it was honest. And honesty, after decades of deception, felt revolutionary. When the Western media caught wind of our Chinese discussions, they lost their minds. Headlines screamed about Chinese colonialism, op-eds warned of trading one master for another, analysts painted nightmare scenarios of African nations becoming Chinese puppets. The irony was stunning. The same people who had demanded we maintain economic partnerships with those who colonized us were now warning us about the dangers of economic partnerships with those who hadn't. The same voices that stayed silent while French companies extracted uranium from our soil for 60 years were suddenly concerned about Chinese infrastructure projects that left us owning the roads. But we saw through it, because when France builds infrastructure in Africa, they own it. When China builds infrastructure in Africa, we own it. That's not opinion, that's contractual fact. And facts, unlike propaganda, can be verified. So I issued another statement, simple and direct. We will partner with anyone who respects our sovereignty. We will resist anyone who threatens it. The color of their flag doesn't matter. The content of their contracts does. That principle became our North Star. Not anti-Western, not pro-Eastern, pro-African. And that's when they realized they had lost the narrative war completely. Because you can't call someone anti-democratic for choosing their own partners. You can't call someone unreasonable for reading the fine print. You can't call someone ungrateful for refusing to be grateful for exploitation. The moment I knew we had won came during an African Union summit. Not the formal sessions with cameras and prepared speeches, but during a private dinner. 17 African heads of state sat around that table, and for the first time in my memory, the conversation wasn't about aid packages or foreign investment or international recognition. It was about trade routes between Lagos and Cairo, about shared currency systems that bypassed Western banks, about continental African satellite networks that couldn't be shut down by foreign governments, about agricultural exchanges that fed African children with African grain. We were talking like a continent, thinking like a family, planning like people who expected to own their own future, and that terrified them more than any army ever could, because they had built their power on our division, our competition with each other, our desperate scramble for their approval. But approval addiction is a choice, and we were choosing recovery. The proof came 6 months later, when their sanctions finally arrived. Coordinated, comprehensive, designed to break us. Asset freezes, trade restrictions, investment bans, the full arsenal of economic warfare. And you know what happened? Our economy didn't collapse. Our people didn't starve. Our government didn't fall. Because we had spent those months preparing, building alternatives, strengthening partnerships they couldn't control, creating resilience they couldn't break. We had learned the most important lesson in geopolitics. Independence isn't a gift, it's a skill, and like any skill, it improves with practice. So when their sanctions hit, we were ready. Not just to survive them, but to thrive despite them. That's when other African nations started asking, how did Burkina Faso do it? How can we build the same resilience? How do we break the dependency cycle? And we shared everything, every blueprint, every contact, every lesson learned through trial and error. Because a revolution that hoards its knowledge is just a rebellion waiting to be crushed, but a revolution that educates and replicates, that becomes unstoppable. The final proof came 3 weeks later, when a delegation of African Union leaders arrived in Ouagadougou, not to pressure me to compromise, but to understand how we had survived, how we had built alternatives, how we had said no and made it stick, because they were tired too, tired of being junior partners in their own countries, tired of hosting military bases that protected Western interests, not African ones, tired of signing trade deals that looked like peace treaties written by the losing side. They wanted to learn, and we taught them, not through speeches or manifestos, through practical blueprints, banking systems that worked without Western approval, trade networks that flowed around colonial bottlenecks, communication platforms that couldn't be shut down by foreign governments. We shared everything. Because a revolution that hoards its knowledge is just a rebellion waiting to be crushed. But a revolution that educates and replicates, that becomes unstoppable. So here's my message to the world. Let the UN threaten sanctions. Let them blacklist our names and block our funds. They've done it before. But here's what they haven't done. They haven't defeated our dignity, not during colonization, not during structural adjustment, not during foreign-backed coups, and not now. We don't need their crumbs when we've found our roots. We don't need their banks when we've learned to trade among ourselves. And we don't need their validation to know that Africa is rising. This is our hour. This is our soil. This is our stand.